Hello. Um, Thank you very well. This is a little bit, so I'm going to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is my first time in Kiev and my first time in this conference. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about a topic which is designing cities what we are doing today, challenges and opportunities for the cities of tomorrow. So essentially, I want to start my talk with this image because essentially, I think that architecture is really about people. I think the ending of Paolo just stated that. The role of a place to human life is essential to any one of us, architects, designers, or not designers, to any one of us. So the question is what is the future of our cities? And the European Commission has done extensive research on what would be the key aspects or the key subjects of what the future of the cities entails. And there are obviously so many of them that we need to make cities resilient. There's questions about urban health, aging, provision of services, the challenges of social segregation, tech in the city, and so on and so forth. But in reality, we always keep questioning. And I think I want to start or summarize some of the key questions that possibly every designer and client should ask. And they might seem very simple, but the answer is not an easy one, or there's not a single answer to it. So one is obviously, how can we make good places to live and work, which is essential? How can we provide connectivity for all? And what would be a place that it's really in tune with the environment, with climate and nature? And ultimately, how can we make it differently? So these questions actually relate to, in summary, these 4 key topics that I'm going to address. The first one obviously relates to people. It has to be for people of all ages to provide that social equity. The connectivity is about what we're providing as social encounters or providing social interactions, and those social interactions convert into transactions. And then there's the key elements of environment and the evolving technologies. So going back a little, we are now living in the urban age, going from the slow to the fast urbanization. So the picture on the left, the picture on the left is London, and by 1950s, the UK was considered urban. And it took 200 years for it. Now places like in China, for instance, the city of Chongqing, it has taken 20 years to grow from 7 million to 15 million. So hence, sometimes that explains why certain urban farms are actually encroached in the middle of high-rise buildings. Now, in urban planning, there's also the transition from the analog to the digital planning. So from Patrick Abercrombie's planning in 1943, where he's describing London's social and functional layout of the city. Now we have GIS software technology that actually tells us a little bit more about mobility, real estate, land uses, heights, density, and so on and so forth. And we can take advantage of that digital technology in order to communicate that information. So there are certain aspects that the digital age is shaping the urban age, whereas we're now designing with data, and then we are able to communicate that data with technologies like AR and VR technology, and then in the construction process, then you have that digital ecosystem where buildings, objects, and people are connected. So cities have many, many layers. It's just like an onion. Many layers that are interconnected, and like every city or like every onion is different. You have onions that have their own culture, onions that have their own health and their own diversity. So this is an example of the London Borough of Islington, And it's like peeling like a layer, layer by layer, and you can divide them into, you could say, environmental concerns, into amenities, into what is the social or what is mobility. Now, and in that way, we are able to analyze and synthesize these layers by engaging a multiplicity of disciplines. This is part of my urban design teamwork at the office. So, what do I mean by people? By people, I mean everything that you see around us. The way you move, the way we interact, the way we read the space, the way we construct it is how we see our cities, our built environment. That there is a nice quote by Professor Alan Penn from UCL in London saying that the DNA of the social world is encoded within architecture. So everything that we see around us is something that we construct within that social world. But obviously we always aim to have that certain, getting the right mix always in when we actually try to design something. What is the right mix of retail, the new trends in workplace environments, designing face-to-face exchange, so you can have more formal and informal collaborations. And somehow we are actually trying to embed that in examples throughout our projects. One of them is Trafalgar Square, within public spaces and making an intervention to make successful, or as much as we can, places at the heart of London. Or if you have a retail environment, which is an Apple store, that is not only about the user experience of the product and the retail store, but it's also the relationship of that particular store to the public space. Mixed-use complexes like this city center, this is in DC, Washington, where all the public space is open to everyone, so it's not private, it's public. And Old Spitalfields Market that we also design with history and taking history into consideration. So Old Spitalfields is actually an old market that is a heritage asset that we had to revamp and having food as a driver. So, sorry. And then there's also sorry, is this playing? This should be a video. There we go. This is our Bloomberg headquarters, because it's also about the workplace and how we innovate on how people might tend to work within a space. The organizational structure and culture is really important to take that into consideration. And it's also about making the circulation efficient, making the kind of workplace environments efficient, and how the actual employees are also connected within them. So, how do we convert then interactions into transactions? And that has to do with connectivity. There is this map that actually portrays the internet within 24 hours around the world. And you can see obviously some of the spaces that are very, very highly connected, which is all around Europe and North America. And there are places like Africa where you don't have that. Then you ask yourself, why? That it's not all about the digital, it's also in the physical world. So interventions like in Medellin, Colombia, there was the first metro cable system introduced that had quite an effect on how the communities in the settlement was moving around, had a positive effect. So, but in some cases, it's not just about the information, it's also a very basic thing, and it's about observing people. Observing how space is used. This was just a few observations that we did in Canary Wharf in the station, and therefore we can go back to take that information and then model this into new technologies that some of the cases are from our colleagues on Marop as a mass motion, and to actually understand patterns of movement and what does that entail in order to design something. Now, within that, the aim is to achieve something that gives a human comfort and gives something that is a little bit more green, a little bit more enjoyable. So infrastructure doesn't have to be, all steel and gray as a transport station. It could also be something that you enjoy and it doesn't look like a transport station. But the connections that a place makes, or the connections that makes a place accessible to other places, is more likely to support community. So if there are locations where there are multiple paths crossing, it's more likely to have social encounters. And this is what these maps represents. It represents the whole street network of London and how the places are connected within them. And when you are actually introducing something like a new connection, like the Millennium Bridge in London connecting the Tate to St. Paul's, it actually has an effect, not only a physical one, but also an economical one. It's producing 100 million economic benefit in a year, up to 8 million crosses per year. This offering gives the opportunity for commercial offering like hotels and others, and it's increasing more visitors throughout the place to be more enjoyable. So if you think a little bit, what is the most basic element that does not change in cities, and it's actually, I think, one of the major challenges, is the streets. It's more easy to change a building or a block, but the street is quite difficult. And thinking back again the Roman roads, the actual, now what London is today, the main bloodlines of the cities, is the most important streets right now. And that tells us a little bit on how to map other areas, like the underground and rail network. And then that also involves assessing information of public transport accessibility levels that is in London. And this actually tells whether you have more access to public transport and is more likely to have higher, denser urban areas. And that's what really is starting to build on what density is. So achieving density is a key challenge nowadays. This is density from London going around the 1900s, but it's estimated that in the next 2 decades it's going to increase by 2.5 million or so. So putting this all together, what does this mean? It means that if you take the basic infrastructure and if you model the whole Greater London with the available information that now in urban planning is doing now, is that you're actually able to see where do people live and where do people work. The red one is where people work, the yellow one is where people live. And then you can start looking at patterns of not only densities, but also patterns of local centers and why that happens, and why the city is as it is today. Now, speaking about large-scale infrastructure, we also have the different kinds of connections. Air flights nowadays, we're able to model this with open source information. So that is the power of also of open source, how to use that information in order to understand something before we design something. This is throughout the world annually. Internationally is the light blue, then nationally is the dark blue. Then there's also extensive research in UCL Energy Institute, where they actually have vast information and shipping of global ship containers around the world, and what type of containers. And then there's the open rail map as well. The whole of the rail around the world, and where are areas in cities that they don't have still yet. That's actually quite interesting if you correlate that with the map of the internet. Cars. We all know that there is a huge correlation between energy consumption and urban density. And there are places like the big cities like London, Hong Kong, or Singapore, or New York, that they have this kind of a mix of, you know, the city of shorter distances, of proximity or mixed use of public transport. But then there are areas that we need to understand why certain cities have happened, like Detroit or Copenhagen, which are poles apart. Detroit is more car-driven, and Copenhagen is a more walkable city, or one of the most walkable cities in Europe. And then the trend is to say, how do we make more efficient the car parking? Now there are smart car parkings existing now around the world, and the micro-mobility or the shared mobility. And this has been an evolving trend throughout, because now you have the Uber or the carpooling or the introduction of the bus, so electric vehicles, and or the car sharing, for that matter. And this is one of our, we tried to put this information and obviously these lessons learned into our projects. This is a project in California where encompassing all these things is to visualize or to envision something that is future ready, because it's not now, it's going to be future ready. And this is what we start to think of as today. Now the environment, almost half of it, what takes the cities, is buildings and infrastructure and agriculture. And a large chunk of that is energy and industry with 41%. What we want to do is on the buildings and infrastructure is to make that little chunk more energy efficient, more sustainable. We have tried to implement that in some of our projects. In some of our most recent one is the Apple Cupertino in California, which is the whole range of array of solar energy. We have also in terms of food production, the Maggie Center in Manchester really promotes the biophilia in food production for the health and well-being of communities. So that's been part of the most recent projects. And then there's an example in a larger scale context is Amaravati, capital city in India. Now this master plan is more or less around 6 square kilometers. And what we were trying to do in this one is to actually model, key performance indicators. What does local culture or different mixed uses have to do with the available green or the available water that we are actually proposing? And how does that work in terms of making the city more walkable? If we introduce new types of mobility, whether if it's an electric bus or even cars still in India, or any other types of mobility, what would be the percentage of making this zero carbon neutral? So that was the aim. So this was one of the in-house tools that we tried to develop within the design process. Now, within new technologies, we all know that there's the Moore's law, that you come from the 1950s and to say, you know, there is this enormous digital microchips that you had before, and now you have it in your pockets, which is the smartphone. And then, as Paolo said, you know, now you're going to be going with, you know, almost at your hand. So we do live connected. We are starting to live in a connected city. But in that same way, and keeping that into consideration, within architecture, we are taking technology into levels that within one click or within a more iterative process, we started to design large-scale master planning. But in order to get to that, we really start thinking about what certain processes we need to do. So taking into consideration all the open source information, all the GIS information, designing the build form, in this case, is really about, yes, achieving the right density. How is the grid going to be constructed if you're talking about a new city or a new settlement? How is going to be, you know, the actual FAR? Can we move streets? Can we move a block? How do we use it? So this becomes technology that is more time efficient. The one you're seeing here is something called City Engine, which is from ESRI, and it's actually what we use sometimes as part of the process in master planning in order to make certain things a bit more compatible to other elements or other urban factors, working more with environmental analysts, more with sustainable analysts, and other types of disciplines. So once we have that information, then we export this, and then we convert that into the next steps of a master planning. So an example of this, of using this kind of technology or research, is a master plan, the one more recent one that was commissioned. It is happening. and it's in the southern region of Kuwait called South Sabah Al Ahmed City. And it's a master plan that is 61 square kilometers, and that is more or less half the size of Manhattan with its Central Park. And it's a population of roughly 280 up to 300,000 of population. You can probably say that is residential, but and slightly a bit more low density, but we wanted to provide that aspect of densifying and creating more jobs and not just to be a suburban one. So with that in mind, just like the onion layers I explained before, we have a holistic, sustainable approach to it to start to thinking about the layers of well-being, open space, mobility, and so on and so forth. So going back to the questions is, ask yourselves, how do you start a new city? How do you bring people to that? Because this place is around 2.5-hour drive from the center of Kuwait. How do you get people there? How do you get people to walk in one of the hottest cities in the world? It's quite challenging. And how do you get people to use public transport as well? Because it's really car-based. So in doing that, I'm just going to show you a little video. Has sound on? Yes.
South Sabah Al Ahmed, a new city, the center of the southern sub-region. An inspiring place, focused on the quality of life for its people, a prosperous and diversified community, the home of world-class education, healthcare, culture, economy. At the forefront of modern living, embracing the latest sustainable technology, a rich mix of residential, retail, entertainment, and public amenities. Free public transport and green networks weaving throughout this inclusive layout. A smart infrastructure that drives eco-education and food production towards a smarter city. A city promoting resource efficiency, creating up to 250,000 jobs. The most beautiful landscapes and open spaces will make South Sabah Al Ahmed City unique in Kuwait. Visionary modular typologies allow for endless possibilities and customization, learning from Kuwait's past to develop the future. The pilot houses will showcase this design vision, celebrating traditional architecture created around shaded courtyards with added modern benefits. Luxury apartments, villas, and townhouses are built with climate intelligence. Spaces that bring the community and families together, a short walk away from the local mosques. The Central Business District is a commercial zone, attracting major multinational companies. The district offers top education, and art, green, open spaces, and high-end retail options. Shaded urban centers also weave between the neighborhoods, creating hubs of vibrant activity. Diversified industries. Transportation, seamlessly connected with a fast rail link to Kuwait City. On-demand transport at the height of comfort. Our sustainability vision for South Sabah Al Ahmed will align with global sustainable development goals, enhancing renewable energy consumption, water security, green resilience, space and well-being, low-impact mobility, and circular waste management. Holistic in our approach, preserving the national vision for a new Kuwait, harnessing digital technologies, improving the lives of residents, contributing to increased efficiency and productivity. The city is designed to enrich the land. Future-proof carbon and ecological footprints are curated through our new sustainability-focused design. A new Kuwait, a global presence, a new way of living, a city that is the symbol of Kuwait's prosperity, leadership, and ambition, built for today, but ready for an exciting tomorrow, inspired by tradition, driven by innovation. South Sabah Al Ahmed City.
So, yes, I'm almost done. This project, we architects cannot do it by ourselves. I think that's obvious. This is a work of an interdisciplinary team. It's not only architects, it specializes in specialists in environment, in landscape, in water irrigation, in local heritage, working with the client, which in this case is the Public Authority of Housing Welfare, so it's a government agency that needs to provide housing for Kuwaiti citizens. And not only for Kuwaitis, but we thought this has to be also a city for everyone, that anyone also can live there respecting the Kuwaiti culture. So when I'm asked what are the future of cities in this case, because the reality is that this is starting to happening, then we ask ourselves those questions like living in Mars. And that actually sounds so exciting, but then you think about these current issues, and then you say, how can we envision now? Why not be living in the city of the future here? So I have the last video that is some of our thought on the ways the future cities might be. Some of them that could be perhaps in the old literature of the flying island of Laputa, or those described by Italo Calvino in Invisible Cities, perhaps, if anybody knows. So we kind of thought of something that we could take home and to say, can this really happen? Can there be streets without cars? Can we do that? I don't think that the rail is an enemy. Sorry, Paolo. But I don't think is that the case. I think that the challenge is how do we readapt those things for the future? The street is the main challenge, it's not the cars. If we put space for the cars, then there will be more cars. If we actually manage that space for no cars, then what we will be putting there? So here are just a few things and a few thoughts.
What is the city of the future? A city that flies, covered and integrated, maybe an airborne city, or a city that walks. Yesterday's visions are closer than we think. Smart technologies will connect entire cities, changing how we live and work. Physical distance will cease to be an issue. Off-grid homes and businesses will generate, store, and distribute free energy for all. Physical infrastructure will become obsolete. More public space, inner city vertical farms, less trucks, less transport. Countryside will transform. Autonomous vehicles and Hyperloop reinvent public transport and logistics. Car parks, petrol stations, and garages disappear. Efficient use of existing roads and motorways create modern green belts. Green and self-sustaining polycentric cities at last could become a reality. Evolve and adapt our existing cities and design new ones that work in harmony with nature and our precious planet Earth.
Oops. So I want to end up with a thought. And it's more of a question, because in reality it all comes down to a balancing act. It's a balancing act between, developing and designing, what the client wants and what designers want, what people want and what developers want. Do we have more public space? There's more private space. There's more community base or not? Is there cars or no cars? So on and so forth. There's always a balancing act on every aspect on how we plan and design cities. So instead of giving the factors of those balancing acts, I'd rather live with another question. How do we balance the needs of today in order to shape our tomorrow? And it's just a provocation, perhaps, for you to take home and to think about it. What would be actually the needs in order to balance what we're going to have in the future? So for me, that is the future. This is part of the open city architecture that we went to. It's part of our architecture for schools, for kids to learn and to design what they want for their future built environment. So some of our colleagues were asked to be involved in that and to give them some basic material and just draw. And they were drawing things like putting trees in all the rooftops, putting playgrounds, putting flying towers. That was a discovery. But in all cases, I think, going back to my first statement, it's not all about technology. Technology is important, the emerging technology is important, information is important, but you mustn't forget that the future is people. We need to design for people, understanding how they move, how we connect places, how those places are going to be converted, and so on and so forth. So I'm telling you now, the future is you, especially the young people. This is the future, and it is here now. Thank you very much.